Neither of my parents wrote. They didn't. As a matter of fact, they were very non-intellectual. My mother had had a brief fling at being a star. When I say a star, I put it in quotes because she was an Annette Kellerman swimming girl. Annette Kellerman at that time, I think, had a group of women who swam. My mother was a great swimmer, and they went around the country. So that was her claim to fame. Aside from that, they were not particular. Neither had been to college, and they were not intellectuals in any way. But I was fortunate. I lived in Elmira, New York, which is upstate New York. I would say most of my formative life, though I was born in New York City. I always wrote. In school, we had compositions to write. I always wrote the compositions. I kind of liked it. And I did, whatever had to do with writing, I did, but I didn't think of it as writing. It was doing my assignments. And then we had a newspaper in Elmira called the Elmira Star-Gazette. And they ran a series called My Most Embarrassing Moment. And they invited letters from people. And they gave them $1 for every letter they used. So I invented, I think I must have been about 13 or something, I invented an embarrassing moment, and I wrote it up, and I sent it in. And the next week, I saw my letter there, and I got $1. And I thought, you can make money from writing, which I hadn't realized. So then I persuaded some of my friends to let me use their names and addresses, and the next time I wrote 3 letters, and I had the whole column. I got $3. And I guess that was the impetus. It said, gee, this could be fun, and you can make money from it. So that was probably a contributor. And I lucked out by having good teachers. I had good teachers through public school and high school, elementary school, high school, and particularly the 3 years in college that I went to Elmira College, which was at that time just a woman's college. Now it's co-ed. But I had a great teacher who introduced us to the whole world of literature and poetry and everything, and really was an inspiration. It was a lovely town. I had my nice friends and all, but I really needed more. So I persuaded my folks to move to Los Angeles so that I could go to USC. Why I picked USC, I will not tell you, except maybe they had a football team that was in the papers more. I don't know why. I picked USC. It happened my mother had a sister who lived in Los Angeles, sister and her husband. And so there was a reason. Anyway, I have to stop and tell you about my parents. You never really appreciate your parents till much later in life, I decided. You always think, you see the problems you had with them or whatever. My parents, I realized, were terrific for me. They made me think that I could do anything I decided to do. I mean, they never told me, no, that's not a good idea, that's not practical, you can't aspire to that. They told me to aspire to everything. And I didn't realize it at the time, but they gave me that. I was an only child. They gave me that terrific confidence in myself that nobody can give you in the same way as your parents. And that held me in good stead. So when I said I wanted to go to Southern California they moved. My father gave up his position. He found one here in Los Angeles. They moved with me, and I went to USC, and I got my bachelor's at USC. I had edited my yearbook at Elmira. I had written for all the literary magazines of the college. I wrote for the literary magazine of USC. I had written all this time. Oh, and I wrote a program for the local station at Elmira. So I had a body of work, no screenplays or anything. And I decided that I wanted to try to get a writing job in the movies. Well, in that day and age, That was a ridiculous ambition. Today, a young person is very much welcomed into the industry, as you know, because they feel the audience is young, and the young people have a kind of a way to communicate with their contemporaries. But in that day and age, young was a dirty word in terms of getting a job in the movie industry. So this uncle that was my sister's husband had several friends who were really high up in the movie industry socially. They were not in the industry themselves, but they traveled with a group of people. So he got me an interview with, well, first with Sam Marks at MGM, who was the story editor at MGM. And I went with my little folio of all my, and I gave it to him. He looked at them. I said, very nice. I said, you know, I know you're going to do Gone with the Wind. I said, and I read it, and I would be wonderful to adapt that. There's nothing like having confidence. And he was very darling. I told him later in life, I kept reminding him, he was so gentle with me. He said, you know, well, I think that Mr. Goldwyn has, actually it was Mr. Selznick, I guess, has a more, I loved his word, a more expensive writer in mind. Well, that I knew I did not qualify for. Then my uncle got me an interview through this man he knew with Robert Sparks, who was the story editor at RKO. So off I went again with a little folio. And, you know, everywhere, that what they did was they always said to you, they patted you on the head, they were very sweet, and they said, you've really got to get more experience. Now, how you were going to get experience when no one would give you a chance to start, I never figured out. But he said to me, after I was halfway out the door, he said, just a minute. There's one producer on this lot, Al Lewis. I think he would take a chance with a young person. Why don't I set up a meeting with you and him? I didn't even realize what a miracle this was, because it was that. But he set up a meeting, and Lewis read my things, and we talked a little, and I became what they called then a junior writer. I think I made like $40 a week. I would have paid them, you know. I would have gone to work, as most people did, waiting tables or whatever, to pay them. But I was a junior writer for about 2 months. And then, as happened then and happens I see in the paper today all the time, the hierarchy at RKO went out. Mr. Lewis went out with them, and I went out with Mr. Lewis. So goodbye, junior writer. But Robert Sparks said to me, look, if you want to stay on here at RKO as a reader, you will learn more than if you try to write something where you've had not much experience and it probably wouldn't go anyway. You will learn more if you, and I said, what's a reader? I didn't know what a reader was, and he explained how you read everything for the producers who couldn't read, and then you wrote synopses. And I said, well, of course. And I went as a reader for $25 a week. Again, I would have paid them, and I was a reader at RKO for about 2 years, and I did learn everything. But I learned more than about what I was doing. I went everywhere in the studio. There were no film schools at the time, so there was no film education. So I got to know the editors. I got to know cinematographers. Bobby Wise was doing at the time, he was editing Citizen Kane at the time. I got to know everything. I snooped on sets when they broke for lunch. I went on them. And I gave myself a film education. And I also met Michael Kanin. Michael Kanin was my husband for many years, lot of wonderful years. And he and Ring Lardner Jr. wrote Woman of the Year. But I met Michael at RKO. He had come on as a young writer, and we what they called then courted for about 1.5 years or 2, and then we got married. So RKO was a great place to start your film career. We had an autobiographical piece that we sold to 20th Century Fox. We wrote it because our son, our older son, was in nursery school, and he was in a cooperative nursery school where a bunch of the parents in a certain neighborhood got together. We decided we wanted to send our kids, they were preschoolers. We hired a teacher who had been a teacher at UCLA in their nursery thing, and she had sort of retired. And in one of our backyards, we ran a nursery. We had a nursery school just for our own. I guess there were maybe like 12 kids. And the rule was that each group, a set of parents, took turns being collaborative teachers. I mean, we worked with the teacher. We spent the whole 1 day a week with the group. Well, we thought that was a great idea for a movie. And so we wrote an original, and we sold it to 20th Century Fox for what then was the largest amount that had been paid for an original up to that time. For an original screenplay was $85,000. We sold, and we were ecstatic. We said, this is going to be Cary Grant, it's going to be Cary Grant, this is going to be a big movie, hot dog. Well, it languished. It sat there. Charlie Brackett, I think, had it first to produce. He was no longer partnered with Billy. You know, they had split apart with Billy Wilder. Mm-hmm. And it was, you know, it just didn't, nothing happened. And then they put it into their B unit. They had a B unit then, and it was demoted to the B unit. We had our money, but we were not happy. We wanted the movie. So they then made it, oh, I know, the title was How High Is Up? And because the kids used to say, little kid, how high is up? You know, that was a typical question, how high is up? And that to us was a metaphor for explaining everything to the kids. So we did this thing about a father who has to be a participating father in a nursery school and what he learns about his kid, which he never knew. He was not really a father, and it was a wonderful story. So they put it in the B unit, and eventually they made it. And I don't know if you all remember, there was a kid, a boy. They had a young boy that had they called him the foghorn voice. He had a foghorn voice. He was sort of a grotesque little boy. They made him the little boy. The little boy was just an average kid, like our kid. We were horrified. They cast it with Dick Widmark, who was very nice in it, but it was not Cary Grant. And this foghorn kid, and they called it My Pal Gus, which was the nail. I mean, that really broke our hearts. Anyway, it turned out to be a nice little B picture. I see it now every now and then, and this little kid with this crazy little voice is in it, and it's just, and you think, well, see, we had no control of that. We were already on 2 other movies, but it came out of an experience in our own lives, and that's where you get a lot of the ideas. My best advice to young people, when they say, where will I get ideas? I said, just live. Don't be afraid to live. Just look around at your own life and everybody's life around you. Read the papers. And of course, I'm a big researcher too. Matter of fact, if I could just research and then hand it over to someone to do the writing, I would love it. The research is fascinating because I love learning new things and learning about people and learning about everything. That's great. I have an endless appetite for that. If you were writing a comedy, you always wrote for Cary Grant. You seldom got Cary Grant, but you always wrote for him. As a matter of fact, we were talking briefly earlier about Teacher's Pet, and there's a story about that. You know, he was our ideal for that. It was the part of the city editor, and it was a comedy, and it needed a man with a certain amount of style and presence, and we thought, so George Seaton, who was the director, and Pearl Perlberg was the producer, we talked about Cary Grant. So they obviously tried Cary Grant. Either he didn't like it or he was busy. They said, we can't get Cary Grant. What do you think about Jimmy Stewart? We said, Jimmy Stewart? Well, that's, not chopped liver. We'll take Jimmy Stewart. That would be terrific. They tried Jimmy Stewart, and he, for some reason, couldn't do it. So a few weeks passed, and they said, how do you feel about Clark Gable? Well, actually, he was the most perfect for it, though he was older. This was in the latter part of his life. It was after Gone with the Wind, and after all that, but he still had, he was better as the kind of arrogant city editor, tough, self-made man. Jimmy would have been too nice and sweet for it, but he could have done anything. And Cary Grant, I could have played anything I ever wrote or dreamed of writing. But it turned out that Clark Gable was very good for it. It's interesting about Clark Gable. People say to me, well, what was he like to work with? I said, well, I will tell you what he was like. He was a big, big star. And he had a right to come on the set and make demands like the big stars are making today, which, by the way, I'm a little ashamed of, and they should be. But he came on. He knew his lines. He never asked for any privileges that anybody else got. He didn't have the biggest, what do you call
dressing
those?
Room or
yeah,
trailer.
He didn't anything. He was fantastic, and I thought, boy, they ought to make that a lesson for some of the stars that I read today are demanding that they have a whole coterie of people who have to be employed. They have to have 16 cars at their disposal and an airplane and this and that. And
it is rather disgusting.
I don't
isn't it?
think that should go with your stardom. Michael and I wrote that as an original because we thought, we said, just what you said, there's this sort of looking down by, it's a reverse
snobism.
Yes, the non-education person. Well, look at who was the president that never could make it because the whole voting population thought he was too smart, too intellectual, too elitist, too whatever. Wonderful. What was his name? Anyway, see, we forget presidents even. But so Michael and I thought that was a fabulous idea. And we thought, let's write a screenplay about that. So we wrote Teacher's Pet. It was it was not a comedy. It was a serious piece. We sent it around, and we had good luck at selling originals of ours, but this didn't sell. So we put it away, and we did a movie or two, and we came back to it, and we said, Garson had just done Born Yesterday, and here was a serious theme done in this wonderfully comedic fashion, and we said, that's what's wrong with Teacher's Pet. It should be a comedy. So we went back and made it a comedy, and it sold immediately. That was what was so interesting. It sold right away, and they bought it, and then we started casting it. At the beginning, we had each written separately. By the way, I wrote separately before Michael and I married, and he wrote separately, so that we knew we didn't grow, we weren't born together. So we both knew we could write separately. The way we would do it, we would talk about a story, and we would sort of, in a verbal way, see where it was going, and we would maybe do a kind of a point outline, not very demanding, just so we knew what. Then we would say, I'd say, oh, I want to write that scene. And he would say, okay, then I'll write this scene. We would divide up the various parts, particularly if we were not doing an original. If we were doing an adaptation, we knew what the story was, we knew what the characters were. And then he would write his very methodically, working very well. Michael would start at 9 in the morning and work till 5 and then have dinner and sleep soundly. I would be, you know, doing all that stuff of avoiding and whatever, and then we would meet in about a week. He would have his nicely, and I would have mine all over the place. But but then he would read my stuff if he could, and I would read his, and we would comment on each other's. And sometimes I would take his stuff and redo it, and he would take mine and redo it with suggestions. Sometimes we would say, listen, this is pretty good just the way it is, I think here and here and here. Or sometimes if we didn't, we would redo it, and we would get a kind of a loopy, lumpy draft. And then one or the other of us, and we would do this. I would do it on one film, he would do it on another. Would take it all and write it through from beginning to end. Even so, we never stopped consulting each other and whatnot, but we found that was the best way not to fight over trivia and over details. One or the other did it. The sacrifice in collaboration is if you have a style of writing, you have to meld it with your collaborator's style, and you get a kind of a in-between style, which when you are writing alone, you make, you know, you do it your way, as Frank Sinatra said. I did it my way. Well, Michael and I worked it out very well for a long time, but we decided at one point that we had been together like 30 hours a day when we were writing. We were together on the work and we were together in personal life, and we said it's too much. Either the marriage has to go or the collaboration has to go. Luckily, we chose that the marriage stayed, and we wrote apart. And that's when I started writing. I started doing my television movies, my 5 television movies that I'm so proud of. I loved them all, and Friendly Fire was no slouch. And Hustling, we just ran Hustling. We didn't, the Museum of Radio and Television ran it about 2 months ago, and then we did a seminar of it, and it still looks great and works well. It really is good.
Doesn't that make you feel good?
Makes me feel great. You see, I have written. Having written, it makes me feel great. I write a movie, and I do not write it any differently for television or for the big screen. They say to me, well, then what about all those interruptions for the commercials? I say, well, we put them in later. I write my movie. If they've got a break at a certain point and we decide where the breaks come, then if I need to write a line just to kind of carve out the break, I do that. But I write the movie, and I have never looked down as there was. I don't think it happens anymore very much. But there was a tendency early to look down on television. Oh, it was a lesson. And maybe still there's some kids who feel that way, who only want to do big screen movies. I say, do it in any form you can, any way you can. Just do good work. If it's lousy on television, it's going to be lousy on the big screen. If it's good, it's going to be good wherever you do it. So I just don't believe there's any difference. For me, at least. Well, I loved all my television movies. I thought they were great. Great, I mean, in terms of my enjoying doing them. And I will tell you about the first one. The first one was Tell Me Where It Hurts. And it was what I was given. They said to me, there's an article in one of the newspapers, and they gave it to me, that said that women were getting together to talk about themselves. And this was before the women's lib movement was on, and all that, consciousness raising and all. This is before that. And so I read this and I thought, That's interesting. That's interesting. What do women talk about? Well, I was going east. I said, I'll do it if I find I can get enough material that makes it interesting to me and therefore to the audience. So I went east, and I had a good friend who lived in Queens. And I went out and I said, would you get together some of the women who are in your Parent Teachers Association? She was a teacher. And I said, I would love to talk to them. So she got them together at her house this one night, and I said, I'm trying to do a movie about women talking together about their lives and whatnot, and I'm going to talk with you. I'm a woman too, so I'm going to talk with you as openly, and I would just love us to introduce some subjects and talk about them, and they were very, you know, kind of a little bit cautious. One of them said a line which I used later in the movie. She said, well, you know, if we say anything really important, it's going to be all over the neighborhood. They were all neighbors. They were in the same. We'll be all over the neighborhood. And I said, do you really think that if you said you were going to tell something that was very kind of personal and whatnot, do you not trust each other enough? You think it'd be all over the neighborhood? And they thought about that, and they mulled it over, and we had something to eat and a little something, and pretty soon they started talking a little bit, and then the gates opened, and they started talking about themselves, about their husbands, about their children. It was, and I said, I'm taping you. And I promise you, none of your names will be used. I will not even mention the area but you will be models for the characters that I'm going to write if I write this. And then I came back, and the next day, and they were even more valuable. Now they were really into it, and they were not, but they really loved it. They had never shared with each other in this way. These are neighbors and women who were together a lot, never done this. So then I wrote this, Tell Me Where It Hurts. And when it was CBS, I think. Yeah, and it was an hour-and-a-half show. And when it came out, I had never seen anything of mine except up on the big screen. So there were no video cassettes or anything at the time, and I saw it. Michael and I sat in the living room, and we watched this, and I watched the movie, and it was nice. It had Maureen Stapleton, had lovely actresses in it, and Paul Sorvino was the husband in it. It was lovely, and we watched it, but I was sitting in my living room. I didn't hear anybody laugh. I didn't hear anybody cry. I didn't hear any, and I said to Michael, I hate this medium. I mean, I want to be in a theater with an audience. I mean, this is for the birds. And then the next day, I went out to do everything that you do. I went to the drugstore, I went to the bank, I went everywhere I went. I heard the women talking about this movie. They were talking about it all over. And I suddenly understood the impact of television, that rather than some movie houses where, you know, where even if 500 people saw it, that there were going to be hundreds of thousands of people who had seen this. It had a very good rating, and it just blew my mind. I realized this was a terrific opportunity. And movies at that time were moving into more escapist movies, and television, rather than some of the junk they do now, they do occasionally, but they were doing really good movies. When you think of Jane Pittman, and all those movies were coming out then. I found my medium now. This is it, and I loved all the movies I did on television for that reason. Yeah, I had directors I worked with. I got on very well with Joe Sargent, Glenn Jordan. I mean, the best directors. I was on the set all the time. We were even in the cutting room on Hustling, which was a big first. Anyway, we had a wonderful time on television, and I very much think can be a fabulous medium for anyone who wants to write. You just have to write good things and fight to keep them good. Research it and get to know everything there is that you can find out about it, so that in a way it's almost as if you've lived it.
Well, the fun thing is you would become an expert in so many things. If you worked at writing things you weren't that comfortable or secure with, you would become an expert.
I could go on the streets and be a prostitute after doing Hustling, I'm telling you. And that research was fantastic. Gail, it came from Gail Sheehy's book called Hustling, which was also a series of articles in New York Magazine. And Gail had done a fabulous job of research, which she does. And she had made friends with the Midtown North police, where most of the prostitutes at that time operated around that area, around 58th and 59th Street, 6th Avenue, and all that area. Someone came to me, actually Lillian Gallo came to me with this book, and she said, would you write this? So I read it, and it had in it street girls, it had call girls, it had prostitution hotels, it had every phase of prostitution that there was. And I said, Lillian, it's too disjointed. You can't encompass all this. But I realized that having stayed in a hotel on 58th Street, just off 6th Avenue, when we go to New York, that's the hotel we stay at all the time, I used to see these girls walking down the street as I would walk down, and I would say to myself, who are they? How can they do that and I can't? What are they? I used to say this to myself, not aloud, and so I said to her, look, I am curious about those girls. And if you will let me do just that part of the book, and maybe the prostitution hotels, because that comes into it, then I will do it. I would love to do it. So she said fine, and ABC said fine. So she sent me over to her police at Midtown North. And she had a great relationship with them because her articles had come out in New York and they were very celebrated, and she did a good job of it. And so they were very kind to me. And I said, I want to come here. I want to go out when you pick up the girls in the vans. I want to come here when you bring the girls in. I want to hang around for about 2 or 3 weeks. And they let me. And I got a great education in what those girls, who they were, why they were, and what the whole scene was. And it was, again, I had to get down and write at some point, but I just loved learning about them. It was terrific. And that's in me. See, I also would say this to young people starting out. The one thing I think you should do is write something you care about. Now, there are times when you're young and you're getting started where you need the money. You just need the money, and you get offered something you don't have much respect for, but you say, I need the money. I need it to eat. I need it if I have a kid. I need it whatever. That's noble. There's nothing wrong with that. Or there are times when that is the one thing that will get you a start, although that's dangerous. But sometimes I say, okay, all right. But barring those two, if you write a piece of junk that you don't care about and you take it just because you're going to write, it, I think, is terrible for you, because very often it's never done. And when it's all over, you've written junk and you have nothing. You have nothing. But if you've written something you like, you love, even if it isn't done, you have something you were in love with. You have that You've had that experience. You've loved it. You've learned about it. It's in you. And I just think that is the best thing I tell whenever I speak around at young people who are starting out at writing. I say to them, just be careful and write something you care about. Just do that. That's the best thing, because then you're investing in yourself. I tell you, I lucked out probably in most of my life. In the movies, in the big screen movies, which was, say, half of my career, 60% of my career, writers didn't often get on the sets. I got on the set sometimes because I had a relationship with the director. With The Teacher's Pet, we didn't, because we were off doing a movie abroad when they were shooting, I think, 3/4 of it. Anyway, but in my television films, I also was a co-producer. And that gave me the right to be on the set. And I think that a writer should be on the set and should be very careful about the relationship with the director. A director who has a good opinion of himself, who is secure, does not resent having a writer on the set. A director who's insecure is scared all the time that the actors are going to go to the writer, or the writer's going to interfere in his work. Writers should not do that. I very often had suggestions to make on the set to the director, but I always took him aside and did it out of the sight of the rest of the crew or the cast. I would never do that to a director, because he's got to be the boss on the set. So you have to work at your relationship, but to have the writer on the set is the greatest. Things you thought were going to work don't work, and you have to make a change. Well, if you're not there, someone's going to make a rotten change, and that's why you see a lot of movies up there full of rotten changes. And I was always there to make changes that were necessary, and that was my baby. I loved it. Friendly Fire came to me as a request from Phil Barry, who was the producer of it, who had control of it at that time and was to produce it. And he said, there's a book, and it's also been an article in New Yorker magazine, their whole article, called Friendly Fire, and I'd like you to read it. And I said to him, which was true, Phil, I've just come off an assignment. I'm tired. I really don't want to read anything now. I want to wait a while. He said, well, just read it. I said, I don't want to like it, because if I like it, I'm hooked. He said, do me a favor, just read it. Well, of course, I read it, and I was hooked. I was hooked. And it was a wonderful, I thought Cordy Bryan, who wrote it, talk about research. He did a marvelous job. The book was full of wonderful detail, and I loved what it was about, and I almost could see the movie right away. So I agreed to do it. I went to Iowa. The ABC sent me and Phil to Iowa to interview the Mullins, who were, Peg Mullen was the leading character in it. As you know, it was the story of a family whose son had been killed by friendly fire in the Vietnam War, and who never got an answer from the Pentagon about really a satisfactory answer about how he was killed. That's all they wanted to know, not even why, how. And they were just put off. And I think if they had ever really told them, none of this would have happened, and I wouldn't have had a movie to write. At any rate, Peg and Jean moved to Texas, and they had put this to bed. They were angry at Cordy Bryan because they felt that during the course of the research that he did with them, he lived with them for a while and all, that they had felt almost like he was their lost son. And then they felt that he had done them in by, in a way, being kind to the commanding officer, who was Schwarzkopf, and who subsequently, is a very big man in in a recent war. Anyway, so they sort of got angry at Cordy, and they had put it to bed after all this time. They didn't want it stirred up again. But I spoke to their daughter and their son, and I said to them, look, your mother had a very strong beef and disappointment in the way she was treated. And if you want this story told, the way to do it is to tell it on television. I am going to write what I consider a very good piece on it, and they will be proud of it, I promise you. And so you convince them to, and so they talked with their parents, and they convinced them to that. Now, we were going to shoot on the farm. They had this farm in Iowa, a lovely farm. But when ABC began to look at the cost of doing it there, they decided they would not. Although they gave permission, they would not shoot. We shot up in California, I don't know, in one of the farm areas up in California. But there was a churchyard where Michael was buried, and it was a beautiful little churchyard. It was a little cemetery next to a church. And I said, how are we going to get this beautiful churchyard? They said, we'll build you a churchyard. Don't you worry, we'll build you a cemetery. And when you see the cemetery in Friendly Fire, that was built. I always say that the magicians of this whole great art form industry that we're in are the people who, the people who make the sets and all of that. They can do everything in the world. I've never got over, you could say I want 4 elephants in a jungle scene next door to the Empire State Building. And I don't mean we now have, you can do everything digitally. I mean when you had to do it by, it would be there. In a week you'd have it. I just find that, that is to me the other wonder of working in films, which you don't have on the stage. I wrote it, and then we started shooting. We cast Carol Burnett as Peg Mullen, and everybody said, "Oh, why did you cast Carol? I mean, wasn't that a big chance?" We said, "Well, first of all, Carol is a very good actress. When you see her, even when up to then she'd never played a dramatic part. When you see her, even in the sketches, which she does." There's some where she's kooky and funny and way out. There's some where she's just wonderful and poignant and whatnot. She is a good actress. She, first of all, would bring a believability to it that would be wonderful. And I said, I'm willing to take a chance. If I do my job right, and I do in the first 2 or 3 scenes, introduce her in the right way, the audience is going to forget all those shtick and all that, and they're going to accept her as Kate Mullen. The job is mine. So I wrote, I thought, very nice opening scenes for her that I thought she could do very well. But I loved the story when we sent her the script. We sent her the script, and we got a call back, and she said, have you made a mistake? Did you send this to the wrong person? Which I love. She is so modest, And we said, no, we sent it to the right person. We would love you to do it if you want to do it. She said, I'm dying to do it, but you think I can do it? We said, we sure do. We think you'll be wonderful. And she was wonderful. And in the opening scene, she has this wonderful scene with her son, and right after that, the audience bought her. I don't think they thought of Carol in her show from then on at all. My only regret is she did not win the Emmy that year. Betty Davis won it because the Emmy voters often vote for a movie star. But Carol really delivered. She was marvelous. So we did it, and the Mullins were down and then I got to talk with Peg on the phone. And I asked her some questions. I talked a lot with the kids. They came out and went on the set, the son and daughter, and they were very much a part of it. And then when we finished, We ran it on, I forget what night, a Sunday night, I think. I was in Washington and on some other business, and I watched it in my friend's house in Washington. And the phone rang after it was over, and it was Gene Mullen from Texas. He had tracked me down, and he said, well, I have to tell you. He said, when the movie started, Peg was in the other room. She said she wasn't going to watch, that she couldn't stand it to watch. He said, so I started watching, but bit by bit, she could hear it. She started, and she came in, and she sat down and watched the whole movie, she said. And we loved it, and we thank you. And from then on, they were like my closest friends. I never saw them in person, but we corresponded, and I have a sheaf of letters from Peg. She, by the way, she never gave up on the Army or on Schwarzkopf or on us. She always felt that they were wrong. She hated the war. She fought against the war down in Texas. She was a rabble-rouser of the best kind. And Jean died a few years ago. I think Peg is still alive. I haven't written to her for about a year or heard from her, but we ended up very good friends, and I was very proud of that movie. Oh, by the way, it was courageous of ABC to do it, because they didn't think it was going to do very well. They thought it would be respected. It would be a nice film that would be respected, but they didn't think they would get big numbers.
Nice credibility.
Yes, they got enormous numbers. And that was another good thing. I mean, we were thrilled that it did that for them and for the Mullins.